Wealth management is not just for the wealthy. Everyone is entitled to their best retirement possible. Welcome to The Retirement Engineer with Jim Kruzan, your path to a bigger, bolder retirement. Brought to you by Kaydan Wealth Management, a firm that specializes in serving the mobility technology industry. In this podcast, we help you maximize your resources and engineer your best retirement through a process-driven approach so you can get the little things right. Drawing from years of expertise, Jim and his guests will simplify complex wealth management strategies and explore actionable ideas to help you protect your hard-earned wealth and take control of your future. Now, on to the show.
Welcome back to The Retirement Engineer. I'm Patrice Sikora, joined by your host, Jim Kruzan. Today, we're diving into the often complex world of individual retirement accounts. Yep, the IRA. We hope to steer you clear of the common pitfalls that could really derail your retirement savings. Whether you're a seasoned investor or just starting to think about your retirement plan, understanding these mistakes and learning how to avoid them can make a significant difference in your retirement experience. From misconceptions about IRA types to strategies that maximize your contributions, we're here to guide you through it all. So, Jim, you ready to go on this?
Sure. Let's dig in.
Okay. First of all, tell me, why is this so important?
Well, IRAs have now been around for nearly 50 years. I think actually the law that originally started IRA came about in 74, so 50 years. It was really for folks who didn't have retirement accounts. So if you're working and you weren't covered through an employer, you could contribute. Then in the early to mid 80s, it became available to anyone who could work and could fund, regardless of whether they were also covered through their employer. And then there were some caveats as to when you could or couldn't fund and at what age you could fund up to. So over the 50 years, the IRA has become kind of the de facto retirement nest egg. Most clients, if you save as most people do through work, participating in what your employer provides, you wind up with a sizable amount of savings that resides in a 401k or ultimately in an IRA. And that is the retirement nest egg. Back 40 years ago, most of those nest eggs were quite small, and folks continued to fund IRA on a regular annual basis as a way of reducing taxable income and putting a little bit of money away. That is still the case today, although with restrictions and 401k, there aren't nearly as many folks who are contributing on an annual basis. But historically, this has been the IRA season. And the reason we're bringing it up is everybody usually focuses on funding IRA for the prior year, right up until the time they file their taxes, which for most of us typically is April 15th. So because this is the retirement IRA season, we thought it would certainly make sense to focus a bit on common trip ups and mistakes people make in participating or transferring or distributing from IRAs.
You mentioned the fact that the IRA has changed over the years. What types of IRAs are there now? It's not just that they've changed internally, but we definitely have different types of IRAs we can access.
We do. First and foremost, I can remember back years and years and years ago when somebody would say, hey, it's near tax time, I've got to buy an IRA. Like an IRA is some type of a product. Like I'm buying a carton of milk, I'm buying a dozen eggs, and I'm buying an IRA. My bank is selling IRAs, or a mutual fund company is selling IRAs. First and foremost, an IRA is just simply a shell. The way I explain it is, think of it as a file folder, and you can, with a big marker, write IRA. The IRA itself, what it really does, the personality of the IRA is really what you put inside of it. So if you want to buy an IRA at a bank, you might put a money market or a CD. If you want to buy an IRA from a mutual fund company, it will probably have mutual funds. If you want to buy it from an insurance company, they may very well put some type of an annuity or deferred vehicle, on and on. So the IRA itself can be quite different and have many different characteristics. Beyond that, over the years, there are many types of IRAs. The one we think about, we're rolling over something or we're funding for a certain amount of money every year an IRA account, that's referred to as a traditional IRA. We also have Roth IRAs. I'll mention the difference there in just a moment. We have rollover IRAs, which are really more pre-tax traditional, but the money coming in isn't from regular annual contributions, but from a huge rollover of a retirement vehicle. We have inherited IRAs where we may actually inherit because we're the beneficiary of somebody else who had one. There are now custodial IRAs, which are IRAs that are open on behalf of a minor who is under the age of 18 who may have earned income and want to contribute. And then on top of all that, there are also IRAs that are available for small business people, the ability to put some monies away. In fact, in many cases, a bit more money away than what an individual would be able to put away for themselves, being covered through work. And those would be SEP IRAs, simplified employee pension IRAs, or simple IRAs. We could spend a whole podcast on just identifying and going into some detail on just those unique differences themselves. For most of us, we're really dealing with, as we accumulate for retirement, really two IRAs, the traditional IRA and the Roth IRA. They really are opposites of each other. The traditional IRA allows an individual to put money away on a pre-tax basis, meaning they can write it off against their income. It helps to reduce taxable income. And they accumulate that money while it's sitting there and growing on a tax-deferred basis. So they're not receiving a 1099, they're not paying income tax on price appreciation or interest. And then ultimately, when they retire, and there are certain dates that are important there, and we can discuss that a bit later, that money comes out and it's fully taxable, taxed just like ordinary taxable income, treated at your highest tax bracket that particular year. The Roth is just the opposite. You can accumulate for retirement using a Roth IRA. Money goes in on an after-tax basis. It does not in any way help to reduce taxable income that current year. Much like the traditional, it accumulates on a tax-deferred basis. You do not receive a 1099 for any growth or earnings, et cetera, with respect to that. And then ultimately, when you retire and distribute from that Roth IRA, it comes back tax-free. Not only the original contribution, which was always tax-free because you've already paid tax on that, but all of those earnings. There are some caveats. The biggest with the Roth, there always are. You got to look at the fine print. The biggest issue is with the Roth, if you want to have the benefit of complete tax-free distributions, the account needs to be open for 5 years. Failing to have the account open for 5 years and pulling money out will cause the earnings to be treated as taxable income. And there would be some penalty with respect to that. So it's important from a planning perspective, if we're trying to get money into a Roth IRA, if we're doing this in conjunction with retirement at some point down the road, let's say we have a 401k and we have pre-tax money, obviously, but there is some after-tax money in there, and we'd like to ultimately roll that out. It really makes sense to open that Roth IRA several years before you retire, so that by the time you do retire and have this liquidity event, that Roth IRA is already seasoned. It already is in existence for 5+ years. So now there's absolutely no time constraint or restrictions on using that to create tax efficient post-retirement cash flow. So there's some really interesting things around the placement of assets within these various IRAs. And I would have to say that the most important thing is to make the decision not so much by what is most expedient today, but really consider what this looks like down the road, post-retirement, from the perspective of what is going to create the most efficient, the most flexible cash flow for me after retirement. And also, it's not an either or. Do I fund a traditional or do I fund a Roth? You can break those contributions up and you can fund both so that you're developing multiple buckets of resources that carry with it different tax structures, which is incredibly important when it comes time to build cash flow.
You're mentioning timing here, and that rolls perfectly right into mistake number 2, procrastination and last minute contributions.
Yeah, this all has to do with kind of time value of money. Having a dollar working for you for a longer period of time has a greater potential to grow to a larger amount. And there are an awful lot of people who fund these Roth IRAs or IRAs during the IRA season, which is around before April 15th. But what they're really doing is they're funding a contribution for the previous year. Right now, we're funding for 2023. And as a result, we're now funding in March or early April, literally 15 months after the first of 2023. And imagine how much more money could be accumulated for someone in retirement if every single contribution they made had an extra 15 months worth of accumulation. It's huge. It's an incredibly impactful difference. So instead of waiting till the last minute, because all of our lives are incredibly busy, and we hope that we have the presence of mind to say, oh my goodness, I've got to make this contribution within the next week or so. In some cases, sadly, that kind of falls off the radar screen. And then we realize, oh my goodness, I filed my taxes. I didn't fund something this year. Well, you can't make it up. You can't do twice the amount next year to make up for a lost contribution. So doing it early, doing it systematically, certainly makes good sense. In fact, if we know we're going to make a contribution, to establish some kind of an auto investment plan certainly makes sense, where every month, every year, at the beginning of the year, that contribution is made. We can cross it off our list and get on to bigger and better things.
And you let it earn some money for you.
Absolutely.
Now, earning money, I think in today's society, very often both spouses in a couple work, and they probably have some kind of program they can contribute to an IRA, a Roth, whatever. But that's not always the case. So the spouse who is not working, what should you do there?
Yeah, if you think about it, and it just happens to be kind of the way it is from traditional caregiving and what have you, there are periods of time where a couple, let's say both professional, both working, one or the other may have a sizable gap in employment because of either child rearing or taking care of aged parents or something else. And when it comes time to consider retirement funding, we don't consider that spouse because there really wasn't much income coming in the household to consider. But there is an opportunity to make a spousal contribution to an IRA of the same magnitude as you would make if you were, in fact, the working spouse. And that has a huge impact down the line. Imagine somebody today who is working under age 50, they can make a $7,000 contribution. They have a spouse who religiously was putting money away in a 401k and has dropped out of the workforce for a year or two to spend time with their newborn. That family can actually fund an additional $7,000 a year for this non-working spouse. And that's true of not only traditional deductible IRAs, but it's also true of Roth IRAs as well. A couple caveats. One is you not only have to be married, but you have to file jointly. Married couples that file separately do not have the ability to fund a spousal IRA. So that's something that catches some people off guard. And the other thing, which is actually a benefit, The Roth IRA has an income phase out where if you make over a certain amount, you're not allowed to fund a Roth account directly. We'll talk a little bit more about kind of workarounds in a few minutes. But when it comes to funding a spousal IRA or a spousal Roth, the limit that is to be considered is the joint limit, not the individual limit, which means that the bar is raised quite a bit, which allows a lot of people to come underneath that and make that contribution that they might not have been able to make directly themselves. So it's a huge opportunity. And if you think about the additional funding capability and what that might mean in terms of dollars and cents down the road, it's huge. To be able to do 2x the amount of retirement for a number of years just creates a much, much bigger bucket, which creates a bigger, bolder retirement and provides more flexibility.
Right. Well, now you and I have both seen both sides of the 50 age mark. I won't say how much further, right? But after 50, there are some benefits to having an IRA.
There's something referred to as the catch-up provision, which allows an individual age 50 to fund an additional $1,000 a year into an IRA or a Roth. Right now, the funding limit is $7,000 per year per person. That $7,000 per year is for a working spouse or could be for a non-working spouse, as we just discussed. But once you're over age 50, you have the ability to fund an additional $1,000 a year. It doesn't seem like a lot, but over time it adds up. Consider somebody aged 50 who decides that now they qualify for this catch-up and they want to make full effective use of it. So instead of funding $7,000 a year, they're now funding $8,000. And they're going to do that until they retire. And let's just say they're retiring at age 65. So that's 15 years of funding. At an 8% rate of return, 15 years of $1,000 a year, that's $15,000 of accumulation. That would grow to about $27,000 in that 15-year period by funding $1,000 a year at 8% per year on average. If it's a couple, husband and wife, doing the same thing, at age 65, they now have nearly $55,000 more accumulated than they would have ever had before by just simply putting that extra $1,000 a year in once they qualify at age 50. I don't know about you, but having an extra 50-some thousand at age 65, I can find an awful lot of really cool things to do with that.
Yeah, if nothing else, it gives you peace of mind too.
It sure does.
Yeah. All right. RMDs, required minimum distributions. Usually people don't even know about this.
Yeah, this is a really complicated area. And in fact, our very next episode, we're going to dive quite deeply into the world of RMDs. And we're going to cover it a 360-degree view of all things RMD, because it also goes into inherited IRAs, and that becomes very complicated. And we're going to touch on a little bit of that again a bit later on in this podcast, but we're going to go really deep on all those aspects in our next episode. Make sure you tune in because it'll be really helpful. A couple of things about RMD that, again, we're talking about problems and trip ups typically with IRA. One of the big trip ups is failure to take your RMD. And what happens then? It becomes quite onerous. So right, an individual today can, if they haven't already started their RMD, they will need to start at age 73. And the amount that they will need to pull out is based on life expectancy. And it's a government table, an IRS table, that determines the factor, which then determines the dollar amount. But if for some reason we didn't, there's now a penalty against what we should have taken out. Early on, that penalty was as much as 50%. Wow. So imagine somebody who was to take 40,000 out of their IRA, forgot for some reason, they have a $20,000 penalty, to say nothing of the fact that whole full distribution would have been considered taxable income as well. During the Secure Act 2.0, which went into law, well, I think it was written in the law in December of 2022, effectively went into law January of last year. that reduced the penalty. It's now 25% instead of 50, still significantly high, but it also provided this proviso where if, you realize you made a mistake and you can fix the mistake within 2 years of the mistake. And there are also some touch points there as well. What is that? How do you determine the 2 years? And is it before an IRS notification or is it before the IRS assigns penalty? But essentially, you now have this window that we didn't have before where you can go back in time and fix it. And if you fix it within a timely period of time, I'm using air quotes to be determined, it's a 10% penalty as opposed to 25 or the original 50% penalty. So while it's still painful, because again, it's still considered a full taxable event, it's certainly workable. So it's important to understand that. When we're talking about required minimum distributions, it's also important to talk about QCDs, which are qualified charitable distributions. Essentially, the government is saying, hey, for those who are charitably inclined, you can consider the use of some of the mandated required minimum distribution for charitable intent. If you redirected some of that money that would have gone to you, which would have been treated as taxable income, but you send it instead to a qualified charity, that helps to reduce your modified adjusted gross income. It also helps reduce your taxable income. So for those who are taking required minimum distributions because they're essentially being forced to, and they do have other charitable intent, by redirecting that funding to the RMD can really help quite a bit from a tax perspective because it will reduce modified adjusted gross income. And that all comes into play when you're dealing with, I'm on Medicare and I'm paying a premium for Part B, and my Part B benefit is now dictated by what my modified adjusted gross income is. So anything we can do to reduce modified adjusted gross income may in fact help us additionally by reducing the cost of our Medicare and other things. Now, with QCDs, originally, they were only available to those who were actually under the gun for an RMD. And way back when, that was 70 and a half, and that age has now creeped up to 73. That said, for anybody who is 70 and a half, they still have the ability to do a QCD, whether or not they're taking required minimum distributions. So it's kind of an interesting planning tool there where, hey, we can take some of that money out of an IRA that's going to be taxable at some point anyway, and the charitable deduction will help offset some of that. Right. And you can distribute in any one given year up to $105,000 of charitable gifts. So if there was some big tax year, you sold a business, sold a large piece of property, have a big taxable event, and you were making regular annual contributions, sizable contributions to a charity, you may be able to reach out to them and say, hey, I'd like to pay the next 3, 4, 5 years of my charitable commitment all in 1 year. So kind of maximizing that $105,000 of charitable bill deduction, which can then be used against the other taxable inputs that you would have that particular calendar year. So it's a really interesting planning tool in that regard.
You've been talking about taking money out. What about if you need the money earlier than you should be taking it out, then you're allowed to take it out?
Yeah, there's some issues there. There's some issues there too.
And of course, there are exceptions as well. There always
are. There are, absolutely. So first off, and I think there's a bullet point on this a bit later as well, the IRA shouldn't be considered your personal piggy bank.
Right.
So we don't want to use it as a way to facilitate purchases. It really should be used as a way to create post-retirement cash flow. It's a way to kind of fill in certain gaps. You know, if we're delaying taking Social Security till 70 and we're retiring before that, I don't have quite that same income I would have from Social Security to count on. So do I use the IRA to kind of backfill some of those weak income years? To use it as a piggy bank is problematic. especially if you're under the age of 59 and a half. The rule now states that you can have access to your IRA without penalty if you take distributions after one turns 59 and a half. But if you take it beforehand, it becomes problematic because not only is it taxable as it would be otherwise, every distribution from an IRA is taxable. But in addition to that, there's also an additional 10% penalty. So if you think about the cost of money, I've got a large purchase or I need money for a down payment on something, and I'm going to take it from my IRA before age 59 and a half versus looking at some financing opportunity, whether I get a loan for that, whether I use a home equity loan against equity in the home, you'll find that taking it out of the IRA becomes a very expensive lending tool. When you think about the fact that you're going to get taxed on it anyway, let's say a 22% federal marginal rate and a 10% penalty on top of that, and you consider that and state tax perhaps, all of a sudden you're looking at a 30+% cost to borrow that money or more. And you could borrow money today at maybe 7 or 8% as opposed to what would have been 30.
Yeah.
That gives you a whole head start. I mean, you can make those payments for 5 or 6 years before you ever get to a point where it would resemble the first year's cost of pulling it out of an IRA and getting hit with the taxes and getting hit with the penalty as well.
What about a Roth IRA though?
Yeah, so the same applies to the Roth 59 and a half. And in addition, the IRA or the Roth, I should say, has to be opened for 5 years. So what we're dealing with now is the ability to retrieve money from the Roth on a tax-free basis, because all the money that went in was after tax. We've never taken a deduction against that. And if you do all the wrong things, the account is not 5 years old or longer, you're not 59 and a half, then all the earnings on that are treated as taxable income as well, also subject to a penalty. So the idea is if a Roth IRA strategically makes sense now or in the future, it certainly makes sense to open one. Even opening one and just putting a small amount of money in there as a placeholder will start the clock on the 5-year period, which then allows one to do a rollover of sizable money into a Roth. And all that money would then immediately be available for tax-free distribution because the account itself has been open for 5 or more years. It's not predicated on how long all the money sits in the account. It's predicated on when the account was open.
So Jim,
really
just to make clear, that's the contributions that could be taken out tax-free, not the earnings on that account.
Correct. So all of your contributions into a Roth IRA are always tax-free because they've already been taxed before they were contributed to the account. That offers somewhat of a strategy. And what I mean by that is the one nice thing about a Roth is even though we have this 5-year rule, we have the 59 and a half rule, we have all these concerns about when we can take the earnings out tax-free, contributions are always available immediately. So you can open a Roth IRA today, make a $7,000 or $8,000 contribution. And if something happened in the very near future, which would cause you to need to start looking for where I can access monies, you can go to that Roth IRA and you can distribute from the account those original contributions without penalty, without taxes, and leave earnings or whatever is left in the account to continue to grow until you achieve age 59 and a half and the account has been open for 5 or more years. So it does provide some flexibility. It's one way of encouraging younger people to put money away, those who might be concerned that they don't want to have that money sitting somewhere where they don't have access for, what could be 20 or more years until they turn 59 and a half. So it's a good way of kind of bridging that gap.
Talk to me about the next mistake, non-deductible contributions and the backdoor Roth IRA.
Yeah. So really the mistake here is not understanding that there are such things as non-deductible contributions. We talked just a moment ago about funding Roth IRA, and we talked about the benefits of funding a Roth, how having monies in a bucket that comes back tax-free provides an incredible planning tool when you start layering in the various sources of income. So putting money away in a Roth certainly makes good sense. However, for a couple that's, let's say, mid-career with decent salaries, they might very quickly come up against the limitations in terms of funding Roth directly. I think this year it's 228,000 for a couple filing jointly. Any taxable income that exceeds that, there's phase out as to what you can contribute, and over 240 jointly, one can't make any kind of a contribution to a Roth. So there's a whole group of folks who would love the opportunity to fund Roth who just simply don't have the ability because they exceed that limit. And that limit, by the way, for an individual, a single filing individually, it's much less. There is a way to get money every year into a Roth, to be able to fund a Roth to the full extent one can fund it. You're just not funding it directly. You're kind of funding it indirectly, which is often referred to as the back door. So the rules are really quite interesting. And there's been some discussion about kind of tweaking and modifying and maybe shutting this loophole, but it's certainly still available. And what that is anybody, regardless of income, regardless of whether you're participating in a plan at work, which also restricts your ability to take deductible IRAs, has the ability to fund to the full extent. That's 7,000 if you're under age 50, or 8,000 if you're over age 50, into an after-tax IRA. So you're putting it in a traditional IRA, not a Roth, because you can't fund one directly. And you're not taking the deduction because it's after-tax money. But then immediately upon making that deposit, you can do a conversion into a Roth. Everybody is allowed to fund an after-tax IRA, and everybody is allowed at any point in time to convert that into a Roth. So it's a way of getting monies that would never have seen the light of day inside a Roth, in a Roth, and be able to do that on an annual basis. There are rules to consider. The biggest is it works best if you don't have an existing traditional IRA. Because when you do this conversion of the after-tax IRA into a Roth, they're going to look at the total amount of money you have in IRAs,
right,
traditional or otherwise. So there may be a tax. So some of that conversion may actually be taxable, because they're going to look at the conversion relative to the total amount of IRA, and there will be a pro rata rule that may cause for some extraction of taxable money from a traditional IRA. So the key is, if you're working closely with an advisor and they're kind of mapping out what cash flow will look like down the road, and if this is a strategy that they would like to use, an advisor who is familiar with these rules would certainly look at ways to reduce, mitigate some of these traditional IRAs that you have, that would open up the opportunity to fund a non-deductible and then do a conversion. I can give you an example of that. My son actually changed jobs a few years ago, and he was with a consulting firm for a couple of years, and he had a small amount of money in a 401k. All the company's match was pre-tax. All of his contributions were Roth. And he left. We rolled that into IRAs. All the company match went into a traditional IRA. All of his contributions went into Roth. And we've been funding Roth IRAs for our kids for forever and wanted to continue doing that. But we now had this problem that we had this traditional IRA sitting out there, which would have created a taxable event on a pro rata basis. Well, it just so happened that my son left that employer and took a 6-month sabbatical before he started work again. So in that particular tax year, he had significantly lower income than he would have in the year he left the one firm or the year he's starting the other. So we elected to convert that taxable IRA, which was a taxable event, but we did it in a very low bracket. So now he has absolutely no IRAs. So we have no problem with continuing with that strategy. Another way to do this is if you have an IRA that came from an employer's 401k as a rollover, you're changing jobs, you rolled this out, not unlike what I mentioned with respect to my son, and you have a current employer who has a 401k that will accept rollovers back into a 401k from an IRA that originally came from my prior 401k, you can remove the IRA, move that back to an employer's plan. Now, there are pros and cons with that. You might not have the menu of investment opportunities that are quite as robust as they would be inside an IRA, but it does eliminate the traditional IRA, giving one the ability then to fund after tax and convert to get more and more of this money in a tax-free Roth. Again, there isn't a single answer that works for everybody. It has a lot to do with what the game plan is, what we're hoping to accomplish, and what resources we have to work with.
Jim, this is more complicated than a game of chess.
It ain't easy.
All right. Let's see. We've got a couple more here to get through. Ignoring later life contributions. Should you be funding your IRA after retirement?
Well, I think the issue is the definition of retirement is changing. So it used to be, when you got to the age of required minimum distributions, which back not many years ago was 70 and a half, and you were still working, let's say, you were prevented from funding an IRA because of the fact that you were of that age. That changed. And now if you haven't earned income and you're post RMD age, which is called distribution age, you can still fund. So we have a number of clients, as an example, who have retired, and they decided, just because they have energy and have interest, they're doing some part-time work, totally underemployed. Folks working as starters on golf courses or working at nurseries seasonally or whatever the case might be, really just to get out of the house. But at the end of the year, they're earning X number of thousands of dollars, might be single digit thousands of dollars, but just the same. If it's money that they just get as a result of getting out of the house and hanging out with other people of like kind, they can now take that monies and contribute to an IRA or a 401k, a Roth or traditional. And they may actually be able to fund for a non-working spouse, their spouse who may also be retired. So that helps quite a bit. I was reading a book not that long ago about retirement, the history of retirement. And it's kind of interesting. This whole idea of pensions and retirement age is relatively new. This whole concept is less than 150 years old. In fact, American Express Company was one of the very first companies to offer pensions in 1875. And Otto von Bismarck, who was the Chancellor of Germany, started the first national pension in Germany in 1881. And at that time, the retirement date was set at age 70. Then later, it was reduced to age 65.
Really?
So 150 years ago, I mean, this is the Ottoman Empire. The idea of retirement at age 65 was created. And just this week, Larry Fink, who is the chief executive officer of BlackRock, the largest money manager in the world, made comments about how we need to fix our retirement dilemma. And one of the comments he made was, people are living longer. They're far more active later in life. And as a result, this whole idea of retirement in and around age 65 is probably not what it should be. And those retirement ages should be perhaps pushed out. I then did a little bit of research and I found this interesting. There was a very eminent Canadian surgeon who graduated from, I think it was Johns Hopkins, and he was a valedictorian. And this is back in, I think it was 1911 or so. And he gave this famous speech about how man's best work is done before age 40. And he called the ages of age 25 to 40 the 15 golden years of plenty. And ages 40 to 60, this is so funny. Ages 40 to 60 were the ages of tolerable, merely uncreative nature. So basically, after age 40, you're just kind of taking up some space. And everybody should be put, this is a surgeon, everybody should be put out the pasture at age 60. This is the thought 110 years ago. Today, I mean, Larry Fink is in his 70s. Joe Biden is in his 80s. There are a number of people who are very productive who get Nobel Prizes for their excellence in their 70s, 80s, and beyond. So the point to all this, and I know I'm going off on a tangent, is if one does have earned income post traditional retirement, it is no longer capped. You have the ability to continue. And because we are living longer, we are generally healthier later in life. Having more resources available to you can certainly help, whether it helps in your retirement or helps from a legacy point of view. So it certainly makes sense. Just because you're retired from your main occupation and you have some residual earned income, consulting or otherwise, it certainly makes sense to fund retirement as long as you can.
Jim, what about, we've been talking about pulling things out, rolling things over. You covered the pitfalls of taking money out. What about rolling over?
Yeah, there are some rules surrounding this as well. And it's an area where people can make some mistakes. So if you have money sitting in an IRA and you want to move it to another IRA, or you have money sitting in a 401k and you want to move that, let's say, to an IRA, whether it's while you're working or after you retire, there are certain rules around this. And the rollover process is either considered direct or indirect. A direct rollover is where you're taking money from the account source and you're moving it directly to another account source. I'm leaving Fidelity and moving to Vanguard, or I'm leaving my 401k and I'm moving into an IRA. The check or the transfer is direct to the other account custodian. You're not touching the money. An indirect rollover is where a firm, if it's a 401k, will issue the check directly to you. If it's a 401k, they're going to withhold taxes on that. And then you will have the check and you will then have the ability to put that into the new account within 60 days, or there's horrible penalty as in taxation. And you have the ability to also put into that any of the taxes that were withheld. Problem with that is a lot of people don't have the liquidity to come up with additional monies beyond the rollover to put in. So you then have to kind of wait till the following year to get your taxes back. It becomes a bit of a problem. The other big trip up with indirect rollovers, other than the fact that we're dealing with this taxes and all this kind of stuff, and you've got to put the money away and you've got 60 days, is these non-taxable rollovers like this, these indirect rollovers. You're only allowed to make one of those in a 12-month period. And there are a lot of people who will pull money out of an account, move it from a 401k to an IRA, and then do the same thing by moving it from that IRA to another IRA, because let's say they're consolidating with some other advisor, and they do that a second time, both of which were indirect. That's a problem. That would be denied. It becomes a taxable event. So rollover pitfalls happen all the time. As with any of this, it's important to work with an advisor who understands these things and can kind of guide you as to the best way to position you for the greatest possible retirement benefit you can have.
Well, I got to say, direct transfer sounds so easy. Why not do it?
It is significantly easier. And I wish most people would. On many occasions, they don't for a variety of reasons. In some cases, it also happens with smaller accounts. You know, if you have an account sitting somewhere, you've left an organization, they might leave it in the 401k for a period of time. If they don't receive any instructions from you, they'll just simply cut a check and send it out to you, in which case now you've got this whole indirect rollover process going.
Our last mistake here is something that annoys me, that people don't pay attention to this. The beneficiaries Make sure your beneficiaries are straight, because you know what? Your estate plan doesn't matter.
Exactly. A lot of the meat of this topic we will talk about in detail when we get back together and talk about RMDs, because a lot of the RMD rules get really complicated when it comes to beneficiaries or inherited IRAs. Just as an example, a spouse inheriting an IRA from their deceased spouse, what they can do with that is pretty significant depending on whether the spouse was of the age where they were taking required distributions or not. It has a lot to do with the age of the spouse versus the deceased spouse. They can roll it into their account. They can take it out over a 10-year period. They can take it out over a lifetime, in some cases using their age or using the age of their spouse. We're going to get into a lot of this next episode. But when you talk about beneficiary agreements and some of the common mistakes there, one, people just don't consider them. Once they're set, it's set it and forget it. And things change often throughout a 30, 40-year period of time. So reviewing those things regularly makes some degree of sense. The other thing that also makes sense is, remember, the benefit, as you alluded to, the beneficiary agreement supersedes trust and very expensive legal documentation. So you can spend a king's fortune cobbling out the most elegant estate plan supported by these very fancy legal documents. And if you've got a beneficiary agreement on a life insurance policy or or an IRA going to somebody else, it has nothing to do with the trust. It's going there. And we've seen cases where couples got remarried, second marriages. One of the spouses forgot to update the beneficiary agreement, death occurs, and the ex-spouse inherits the IRA.
Wow.
Big problem. The other thing is with children. And as children get older and they have their own families, you might want to revisit the IRA as well. Traditionally, you have a primary beneficiary, which is typically the other spouse. If something happened to me, it goes to my wife. If something happened to her, it would go to me. If something happened to both of us, it goes to our children. When you have multiple children listed, equal or survivor, which is typically how it is, it's like 50-50%. Equal or survivor just simply means last man standing. So if at the end of the day, there's just one of the three children that survived you, it's all going to that individual. As families grow, your children have children, you start to have grandchildren. And as a result, you may want to reconsider that a bit. Now, one of the easiest things to do is to kind of change the contingent beneficiary from equal or survivor to per stirpes. It's a Latin word, and basically it just means of lineage. So the idea is, if something were to happen to child A or child B, and they were no longer alive and available to inherit money from mom and dad, that portion that would have gone to child A or child B will now go to their children, that next generation, as opposed to last child standing gets everything. In this case, that portion would go directly to their descendants. And it may be something that a client was considering. It may be something that the client thought they already had in place. That was their intent. But in many cases, the default is just, let's list the children just as they are, and whatever the equal or survivor or percentage thereof. So having per stirpes provides a little bit more protection, getting that money easily to that next generation. So it's something to certainly consider. But regarding all the pitfalls and issues, considering inherited IRAs and then subsequent distribution and RMD rules, we're getting into a lot of that this next episode. At the end of the day, all of this stuff is somewhat complicated. It can be quite confusing, and problems today only manifest later in life. So certainly work with a competent advisor, somebody who is kind of skilled in retirement planning and cash flow management, and hopefully you'll be able to, as a result, avoid many of these trip ups.
Jim, there was so much in this episode. I thank you so much, and I look forward to the next one on required minimum distributions. And listeners, As we close today's episode on these crucial IRA mistakes to avoid, as Jim said, there's one vital piece of advice: the significance of finding a trusted advisor. Navigating the intricacies of IRAs and retirement planning, it is no small feat. You've just heard a lot of stuff that, for me, was, can I keep up with this? No, let me find someone who I trust who can help me with this. We've covered a lot. A proactive partnership with a financial advisor can help you engineer your retirement with precision and care. And again, next episode, required minimum distributions. And that is a topic you won't want to miss, especially if retirement is on your horizon. Please be sure to subscribe to the Retirement Engineer podcast so you don't miss future episodes. And follow @Kaydan Wealth on social. Let us know what you think in the comments, and please share topics you'd like us to discuss in future episodes. Following and sharing this podcast helps our small show make a larger impact.
Thank you for listening to The Retirement Engineer with Jim Kruzan. Click the follow button to be notified when new episodes become available. Visit our website at www.kaydanwealth.com or give us a call at 800-638-6900. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of Jim Kruzan and this episode's guests, not necessarily those of Kaydan Wealth Management. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning.